Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 1st of July. So now that we've hit July, we are towards the very ending of our semester. And you can see in the notes below that what I have scheduled is this upcoming Thursday for us to catch up with anything that we haven't done, and just to leave the rest of the class up to you to work on paper number 2, because paper number 2 will be due on the 8th, which is our last day of class, which is a week from today if you're watching this on Tuesday. And what I will do is post our final exam at the time in which we would normally meet in a face-to-face class, which would be 9 a.m. And you will have 24 hours in which to take that final exam and submit it to me via my email, which is how my grading program works best, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And certainly I don't expect you to spend 24 hours on that examination. If you were taking it in an in-person situation, you'd spend approximately no more than 3 hours working on that exam, which is what you should be devoting to our final, which will be an essay exam, and it will be open book, open notes, so you can utilize all of the course resources that we've covered over the course of this semester. And the final exam is just a way for you to synthesize some of the major ideas that we've been examining over the course of the semester. I understand that anything that you write in a final wouldn't be as polished or as well written as what you would do with the paper, because you've only got hours rather than days or weeks. But still, I would expect that for the final you would have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. Those are the bare bones minimums. And that this is an opportunity for you to show what you've learned over the course of the semester. And you will have choice within the essay prompts as well. In terms of where we are, last class, unfortunately, I wasn't feeling very well, so I posted an old class video where I covered incidents in the life of a slave girl, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that today, as well as our last text of the semester. And we end the way we began, with Kate Chopin. We started with the story of an hour with Kate Chopin, and we end with the awakening with Kate Chopin. So, having a slave narrative, particularly a female slave narrative, is something that's quite unique. And what this narrative tries to do is to bring forth all of the hardships associated with slavery, with calls for reform. So, target audience, think of someone like perhaps a Mary Elliott from Persuasion, because this is all happening at the same time. And it's hard to believe that there is so much privilege and leisure in one part of society and so much degradation and cruelty in another part of society. In addition, Harriet Jacobs uses many of the tropes of the 19th century sentimental novel, which probably made her reading, or I should say her writing, easier for audiences to read because they were experienced with 19th century romance novels, where the focus is on decorum, the focus is on virginity, and what we see is virtue under siege. And we definitely see multiple layers of resistance, both passive and active. In fact, we've seen that over the course of the entire semester. And this text, perhaps more than any other text, is about how does one remain true to oneself while maintaining self-respect. Certainly, we've seen that in the other texts, but these have all been fictional characters. And I'm astonished still at the incredible cruelty that human beings can inflict on one another. So, part of this text is an educational manual. And I'm still stunned that this was something that was not examined in my own curriculum as a student. So I suspect that many of you are probably in the same situation. This might be your very first experience to Harriet Jacobs' story, writing under the pseudonym of Linda Brent, making sense that she would want that distancing technique. And even though she's not necessarily a trained author, the fact that she could read and write was revolutionary at the time. Remember that she was a slave. And utilized some techniques, such as choosing a name, Linda, that means beautiful in Spanish. So there's there's symbolism there, just like there is symbolism with some of the names of the other characters. Flint, for instance, is hard and steely. Sands is something that is unstable, and that suits both characters quite nicely. We see female bonding and the importance of female bonding. Once again, we have a story where we don't have a mother present. Again, not that I had deliberately chosen it to be that way, but it seems to be a running thread. The grandmother basically takes the place of the mother figure for Linda Brent or Harriet Jacobs. And we see how important religion is, go all the way back to the cult of true womanhood and the four pillars of what would be considered appropriate for female. And obviously piety is one of this, where the grandmother basically is ready to reject Linda because she has given up her virginity. Basically, Linda has no choice. It's either to be with someone who is not of her choosing or to be with someone of her choosing. Neither are a man that she loves, which is rejected by her master. So these seemingly impossible events are verified by scholarship, and we see, if perhaps in this tale more than any other tale, the power of reading and the power of writing. Because if Linda Brent had not learned how to read or write, none of this would be documented for us. Think of it as both a sweet and bitter tale. There are some positive things that happen in terms of love and bonding and achieving ultimately freedom, but there are definitely many negative things in terms of sacrifice, in terms of imprisonment, and in terms of just self-respect. And the fact that Linda says that she needed to have someone, even after all she experienced, buy her liberty, is something that will never sit well with her, even though the intentions are good. The idea that one can buy or sell a human being. And we learn what it's like to be a woman in a male society. We've seen that all semester long. But in this text, we see what it is to be a slave in not only a enslaved society, but a free society, because she goes to the north and finds a very different kind of discrimination. And we also learn what it's like to be black in a white society in this tale. She begins by talking about she was a slave in North Carolina, but she didn't realize that until her mistress, who she quotes as, or labels as, quote, kind, unquote, bequeathed her to her 5-year-old niece. Again, the idea is that slaves are property, so a kind master does belong, I believe, in quotation marks, because there is that idea of ownership. And Linda is subjected to all kinds of horrors by Flint's daughter. Daughter's, I should say, it's by, I'm sorry, by the Emily Flint's father, is what I meant to say. And as Linda gets older, sexual pursuit is one of the many reasons why she is under siege by basically Mr. Flint. Again, a flint being something that's hard, that's jagged, that's steely, and I think that suits his character very much. We see sexual pursuit and how that would be the specific lot of female slaves, something that perhaps male slave narratives didn't talk much about. And we see Linda's strength as well as her intelligence and her cleverness in order to confront him. We see his strength, for instance, in chapter 7, when she says, "How I despise you." Now, speaking to a master that way could lead to death. But yet Linda does so. It's one thing when we've got Jane Eyre speaking to a fictional aunt in that manner, but it's another thing where we've got real people talking to one another when one has privilege and power and one doesn't. William, the slave child, shows one of the many dilemmas of slave children, which is a whole other story about what it is to be a child in an adult society. Should he follow his father or should he follow his slave master? And it's a lose-lose situation either way. And as William I think it's so interestingly says, he doesn't so much mind the smart of the whip as he minds the idea of being whipped. It's the principle of the thing. The physical pain will disappear, but the emotional pain won't necessarily disappear. And of course, we see how Mr. Sands continually promises Linda her children's freedom children that Linda has birthed through Mr. Sands, but of course, children take the lot of the birth mother. So ultimately, Mr. Sands does not have to be responsible for these children. And these children would be seen as enslaved because they take the lot of the mother, not the father. Mr. Sands, who ultimately becomes a politician, no less, and instead of railing against the system, he basically supports it politically, even though he's considered to be a much more gentle slave owner, if you will, than many of the other individuals who are highlighted in the novel. We see how Linda's grandmother accepts her fate as the will of God, and Linda rebels. I can't help but think of Jane Eyre when Helen Burns basically accepted her fate of being ill and going to God's kingdom, as opposed to Jane Eyre, who fought against that, and perhaps that's why she didn't die of tuberculosis and she was able to live a life that was at least somewhat fulfilling. So 7 years, if you can imagine, being in that garret that's 9 feet long, 7 feet wide. If we were in a face-to-face class, I would ask the tallest person in the room, that would definitely not be me, to stand up so that we could get a sense of what the dimensions of 9 feet long and 7 feet wide might be. But it's very coffin-like, so it's symbolic as well as literal. And the question is what is freedom and what is slavery? Can one be free even though they're physically confined? And can one be perhaps not free even though they are physically unconfined? So Flint tells Linda in chapter 15, you desire your freedom for yourself and your children, and you can only obtain it through me, which is not true because Linda does find a way to obtain it without him. At age 40, ultimately being purchased by a Mrs. Bruce, again, all pseudonyms, and finally given her freedom. Again, she talks about how wrong that seems to be granted freedom. It's a God-given birthright. We see physical and mental and emotional abuse, brutality, cruelty, hardship, degradation, persecution, lots of hypocrisy as well. The hypocrisy in the political world, the hypocrisy in the religious world. In fact, that was one of the questions that I had asked you, was to talk about what was, in your mind, one of the more hypocritical acts in the text. And we do see Linda urging white women, because specifically they are her audience, not just a white audience, but females who are also experiencing disenfranchisement, that instead of feeling jealousy and rage against female slaves because their husbands will be having sexual relations with their female slaves, they should all really unite, both white and black women, for experiencing inequality and disenfranchisement in society and work against those in power. So the ultimate purpose of writing this narrative is to educate and to spur reform. And in terms of education, you may or may not have learned some of the things that we learn in this text. For instance, slave auctions were held on New Year's Eve day. Or New Year's Day, I should say. So this was a very sad time for slaves, when families would be torn apart. And we see how ultimately the male figurehead was removed from his responsibility of caring for the family, which is something that I think that black families still struggle with generationally, even in contemporary times. The inability to choose one's mate, which is what Linda said. And this is very different than a situation where we're talking about making a good match, where free black men are given the privilege, quote unquote, of earning their own wages, and oftentimes had to turn over those wages. How one could buy one's family's freedom. And the praying to die, that death might be better than living such a life of cruelty and horror. The muster, which was, and this is a quote, an opportunity for the low whites who had no Negroes to scourge to show their subserviency to the slaveholders, not reflecting that the power which trampled on the colored people also kept themselves in poverty ignorance and moral degradation. So there's lots of levels of disenfranchisement. It could be based on gender, it could be based on ethnicity, it could be based on economic class. Here's again another opportunity where those who are poorer and have less access to resources could join forces with other disenfranchised groups. But instead, what they're encouraged to do is to show their superiority over individuals who have even less power. The fact that the slave follows the lot of the mother, as I had indicated earlier, that slaves were good enough to serve as wet nurses to white children. Basically, what they would do is they would nurse these children. The fugitive slave law, so in theory, the North was a place of safety, but a slave could be brought back from the North to the South. And despite the, quote, safety, unquote, that the North might afford, at least as compared to the South, there was, and might I add still is, racism. So one of my favorite lines in the book is in chapter 9 when Linda Brent says, "I was 21 years in that cage of obscene birds," which I think is a highly literary image. So again, even though this text might not have all of the literary elements that we've seen in other texts, I still think it stands up in the same company. And an interesting insight in chapter 35 that what Linda found, at least in other areas outside of the South, that I was resolved to stand up for my rights. So individuals concluded to treat me well. But some poor creatures have been so brutalized they'll sneak out of the way to give their masters free access to their wives and daughters. So this transitions us to ultimately the awakening, which is also about birds. And we know that Kate Chopin is very fond of using bird imagery just by reading her short story, The Story of an Hour. Chopin was banned and ostracized after writing this awakening. It is a novella, which means it is longer than a short story. Obviously, it's longer than The Story of an Hour, but it is shorter than a novel. Certainly, it's shorter than Jane Eyre. And The Awakening is a wonderful title because it shows all the different levels of awakening that our main character experiences. Now, Chopin herself lived a rather unorthodox life, not surprising considering the kind of writing that she did. She was bored with parties. We know how important parties are after reading Persuasion. She would read literature. We know how dangerous literature is after going through almost the entire semester here, reading women in literature texts. She smoked cigars, which would still be considered unusual for a female. She walked alone. And we talked about how unusual it would be for a female to be by herself, which is why when Mrs. Mallard goes to a room alone, that in and of itself is revolutionary in The Story of an Hour. She insisted on privacy. She dressed unconventionally, and clothing was one of the many ways to suppress female. And she ran the family plantation after her husband's death. Now, by all accounts, she had a happy marriage, but we do know from just the few texts that we've read from Kate Chopin that she talks about how marriage can oftentimes be an oppressive institution. We'll never know whether she was talking about a personal experience or she was just talking about societally or both. But we see the themes of self-assertion. That's something that we've seen almost throughout the entire semester. Repressed sexuality. This is the most sexual and sensual of the texts we're reading, probably why it was considered to be so unorthodox that it was banned and ostracized. And independence. And we see again her intellectual, her emotional, and her physical awakening, and the intellectual, emotional, and physical awakening of female. So right from the first book, and notice that even though this is a novella, it's divided up into sections, that book 1 shows an imagery or an image of a caged bird. Of course, that's supposed to represent female, that females are encaged and kept basically by those in power. The bird speaks an incomprehensible language. The idea that female is speaking and no one understands or no one cares to understand what she's saying. And we even get the translation of what the bird is saying in another language, which is get out, which is the message for Edna that she needs to get out. And we know that swimming is very freeing for Edna. Water can be very cleansing. Water can also be very sensual, particularly when you think about the tides moving in and out. Water is also perhaps representational of the womb and birthing. All of those things play a role when Edna swims, and note that she takes off her wedding rings when she swims. In other words, this is a place and a time when she's not bound by the restrictions of marriage. And we learn in book 3 that Mr. Pontellier is disappointed his wife is not interested in his concerns and is not more attentive to the children. Again, go all the way back to the cult of true womanhood and what woman's role was expected to be. In fact, he looked forward to leaving his family for the excitement of work in the city. And again, female weren't afforded that kind of opportunity usually. So that means they didn't have economic or emotional fulfillment that you could find through work. Risky behavior for female at the time, I think, is illustrated wonderfully in book 4, where Madame Ratignolle is selecting a bonbon that might be a little bit too rich, a piece of candy, and hurt her. That's going to be in direct contrast to the way that Edna lives. In book 5 and 6, we get references to the sea as being a seductive force and symbolic of the womb, that it cleanses, it rejuvenates, it caresses, it offers freedom, it offers escape. And then this is where Edna begins to finally realize her position as an independent being when she's on holiday and she meets someone that first she's infatuated with and ultimately realizes she's in love with, someone who's better suited to her in terms of temperament. She married Mr. Pontellier in part because he was a good match and also because it defied the expectations of her parents. And of course, this shows a little bit of Edna's rebellious nature. At one point in book 7, Edna removes her collar and opens her dress at the throat. This is a symbol for freedom, the idea that she's been choking. She has a passionless marriage and is fond in an uneven way of her children. Of course, that's supposed to be the exact opposite of how a mother figure is supposed to feel towards their children. And in book 9, she meets Mademoiselle Reisz, who's is unusual because she's unmarried and she's also quite passionate and she follows the arts. And she plays Chopin. There's a little pun here. We're talking about the musician Chopin rather than talking about the author Kate Chopin. Edna is struck by the passion of the music and the independent lifestyle that Mademoiselle Reisz is able to live. But she pays a price for that. She basically is ostracized. Edna finally learns to swim in book 10, which again is an illustration of her independence. Notice how all the males try to take credit for teaching her how to swim rather than giving her credit for doing it on her own. And we see in book 11 a battle of wills. It doesn't seem like it's much. When Edna and Mr. Pontellier are trying to decide who's going to go into the house first. It almost reminds me of these petty arguments that contemporary couples might have over remote controls or socks on the floor. Mr. Pontellier wins, at least this one, but just because you've won the battle, that doesn't mean you'll win the war, so to speak. In book 13, we see Edna having a sexual awakening, and right when she's awakening from a nap, she's stretching out in bed and she feels hungry when she awakens. And that's literal hunger. She wants food, but that's also figurative hunger. And also she's sensually hungry. So in book 15, Edna's upset that Robert, whom she's developed an attachment with over holiday, is leaving town. This is when she first admits that she has an infatuation with him. And in book 16, Edna says that she'd never sacrifice herself to anyone, even her own children, though she'd give up her life for them. And this does remind me of incidents in the life of a slave girl, that it's possible to lose one's life but still not lose one's sense of self. In books 17, Edna is refusing to take callers on Tuesdays afternoons. And after reading Persuasion, we know how important that is. Mr. Pontellier, meanwhile, is continuing to season his bland soup. Again, the soup is supposed to be a metaphorical reference to his bland life. Edna tries to throw away her wedding ring, in other words, to reject her marriage, but the maid returns it to her. And Edna lives a life of comfort and privilege. Edna, though, doesn't envy the domestic harmony or what would appear on the surface of the domestic harmony of couples like the Ratignolles. That is not what she wants for self-fulfillment for her life. In book 19, Mr. Pontellier is shocked and angered that Edna is disregarding her duties as a wife and mother, which were the primary roles for female at the time. He even wonders if she's mentally unstable. Notice the quick go-to that if a woman doesn't follow the expectations that we identified in the Cult of True Womanhood, well then, she must be insane. In the following book, or in book 21, Edna learns that Robert is writing letters about her to Mademoiselle Reisz. It turns out that Robert is more than infatuated with Edna. Robert is in love with her. Mr. Pontellier, at his wit's end, in chapter 22, visits a physician because his wife is making him feel, quote, uncomfortable, unquote. And the doctor wondered if there was perhaps another man involved. But out of decorum, he said he knew his Creole too well to state his concerns out loud. So we're talking about a Louisiana society that is very much based on decorum and rules. And obviously, one would never break the expectation of suggesting that that someone was having an affair, an illicit affair. Of course, he knew that would be more than just impolite. It would be downright rude and offensive. So the doctor can think what he will, but certainly he's not going to be raising that. And as we continue on, we see that in book 23, Edna's happy her husband is often at work, because if he were home, they wouldn't have anything to say to one another. So again, this illustrates the kind of marital union where it's not based on emotional connection. And Edna's father actually believes that Mr. Pontellier is being too lenient with Edna. And meanwhile, Edna is enjoying more and more solitude, and she has the leisure to read. And this is very important, again, when we think about our paper topics about how a book could ruin a girl. So Edna begins spending more and more time with a new male friend, Mr. Arobin, because remember, Robert has left town because he doesn't want to be tempted to pursue a relationship with Edna. And Mr. Arobin is infatuated with Edna. And Edna, while she might feel some attraction, she doesn't feel love and spends her time wondering what Robert would think of her new relationship, not what her husband would think of the new relationship. So in chapter 26, Edna decides to rent and move into a small house. She calls it a pigeon house. Again, very Chopin-like, making bird references. That she can afford on her own with the small inheritance and the income she generates from selling her sketches. So you see the dangers of a woman having financial freedom is that now she can make independent choices. Edna's pleased to hear that Robert is returning, and at this point will admit that she loves Robert. And Edna acknowledges she knows her character would be viewed as wicked, but that's not going to stop her actions. And again, it reminds me of Mrs. Mallard and Story of an Hour, that it doesn't matter what the intent is. Arobin kisses Edna. She feels physical passion, and they consummate their relationship in chapter 25, 26, 27, chapter 28. Edna regrets that her lover isn't Robert, and not once does she consider her husband, her married husband at least. Now, in book 30, Edna turns 29. Even in contemporary society, 29 is a pivotal life stage year, particularly for female. It's usually viewed as the breaking point between youth and the beginning of aging. Certainly during this time period. Remember, we had talked about in Persuasion how Anne was starting to lose her bloom as she was moving into her late 20s. Mr. Pontellier eventually learns of his wife's intention to move out. He's concerned what the neighbors will think, and that perhaps the neighbors might think that the family's experiencing a financial decline. How could you not think of Persuasion in the beginning with the Elliots, where that was the major impetus for them to try to save face by moving to somewhere else? And of course, Mr. Pontellier is less concerned about the state of his marriage and more concerned about the state of his economic reputation. Finally, Robert returns to town in chapter 33. Robert sees Arobin's picture at Edna's house, and he's jealous. And remember that Edna's been sketching Arobin and other individuals as well. We see finally Edna kissing Robert and Robert kissing Edna. They admit their love for one another, and when it looks like they might begin a relationship with one another, Edna is summoned by Madame Ratignolle for Madame Ragnoli's birth. The She's having yet another child, which is what is expected of her. And even though Edna isn't needed there, Madame Ragnoli wants Edna there because ultimately, Madame Ragnoli and probably most people realize that Edna is tempted to leave her marriage. And ultimately, what Madame tells Edna is to think of the children, that Edna has a responsibility to her children. And it's a very true responsibility, and it's one of the ways that Story of an Hour is very different than The Awakening. Again, perhaps another reason why The Awakening is seen as so scandalous. We are never told in the Story of an Hour that children are involved, but we are told in The Awakening that children are involved. So as much as we are meant to empathize with Edna, because we get the text from the perspective of her life, we know that ultimately the children have some sense of expectation, and rightly so, of both parents serving as caretakers. And it's something that ultimately Edna thinks that she's unable to fulfill. But when Edna returns home and sees that Robert is left, because he realizes that they're going to be pursuing an illicit affair, and he doesn't want to do that, he leaves a note saying goodbye and saying that he's doing so because he loves her, so he doesn't want to compromise her. Think about what this will do to her reputation. It will destroy her. So earlier on, we were told that Edna wouldn't sacrifice herself for anybody. She would give up her life, but she wouldn't sacrifice herself for anybody. That's a little bit of foreshadowing with what happens at the ending of the book in chapter 39. Edna cannot sacrifice herself for her children, despite the pleas of people like Madame Ragnoli during birth. Edna undresses, which is supposed to be a symbol of escaping repression and oppression. She goes into the sea naked, and she swims until she is exhausted. And the ending might be a little bit unclear, just like the ending of the Story of an Hour might be a little bit unclear. But if Edna swims as far out as she can, in other words, that's supposed to be a metaphor for going as far out as she can in terms of societal convention, and she's exhausted, she can't come back. So she drowns. In other words, she commits suicide, understanding that she is never going to be able to be accepted in a society that has all of these expectations for female that she cannot fulfill. Both the Story of an Hour and The Awakening end in female death. And again, I don't think Chopin wants us to celebrate that. On the contrary, she wants us to rail against that and change a society where that seems to be the only option for female to achieve freedom. So that gives you an idea of some of the elements of The Awakening, which is also a possibility for a paper topic. As you know, paper number 2 is pretty much the same as paper number 1, the distinction being that paper number 2 is on one of the later texts of the semester. So you're probably writing about Jane Eyre, or Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, or The Awakening. Emily Dickinson is also another option, but writing about a poem is a bit different than writing about a novel. Just like when we were talking about writing about the Story of an Hour, that would be different than writing about, let's say, something like Frankenstein or Persuasion. So obviously, if the shorter the piece is, the more detailed the analysis has to be. In approximately 4 to 5 pages, but as long or as short as you think it needs to be for you to defend your thesis. And I encourage all of you to read the comments that I made on your first paper very carefully, so you can incorporate those suggestions into your second paper. So I saw the first paper was a learning exercise, and the second paper is basically what you've learned from that learning exercise. For those of you who think you might want to submit in a revision for paper number 1, that would be due also the time that paper number 2 is due and the date in which our final examination will be occurring. And again, that date happens to be Tuesday, the 8th of July. And ideally, you would hand in your paper before that, but certainly by that point, by 9 a.m., because at 9 a.m. is when you can begin taking your final. Again, you've got 24 hours to take that final, not that I would expect you to use all 24 hours. And that would be the ending of our semester. So for today's attendance question on our class discussion forum, that'll be due on Thursday the 3rd. And certainly, again, if you need an extension, please let me know. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. What do you think is the most scandalous act in the awakening and why? And trust me, there are quite a few scandalous acts. The more important piece of this question is the why. There really is no right or wrong. So identify what you think is one of the most, if not the most, scandalous act in the awakening and indicate why. And then next class, we'll just tie up some loose ends and it'll be a short class so that you can work on your last paper. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on with our last catch-up class before the final examination. Take care. Bye-bye.